Good morning. My name's Eric. I'm the pastor here. It's great to see each of you here today. We are talking about family matters because here at Cornerstone, we believe that families matter. Families are important, and families can be a source of great joy or a source of great stress for us, right? And so we're trying this month to talk about all sorts of different issues and topics that deal with the family. Some of them are easier to swallow than others. Some of them are more sensitive issues than others. But I hope that as we've gone through this series that you've got something that you can take with to be a blessing to you and to your family. Each week of the series, we've been kind of talking about different sitcoms. We have this little stage design behind us to kind of illustrate, the idea of a home, and sitcoms have a tendency to do that. We've talked about Who's the Boss, Home Improvement, 8 Simple Rules, and last week we talked a little bit about the Brady Bunch. Today, I want to just kind of start off by talking about a sitcom that was a spin-off. Now, spin-off sitcoms don't usually do very well, do they? But this sitcom was successful, and it spun off of another successful sitcom called Happy Days. All right, so does anybody know what sitcom was the spin-off of Happy Days? Anybody in the room know? Laverne and Shirley. Now, I don't know why I know this show, because I was really little. I don't even know. It was actually on. It was on from 1976 to 1983. So, I was just really, really young when it was still on TV. But I don't know that my parents necessarily watched it a lot, but I remember the opening sequence, that song, Making Our Dreams Come True. And then there was that weird thing they said at the beginning, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have it written, Schlemiel, Schlemazel, Hassan Pfeiffer Incorporated. Like, you know what that, yeah, does that do okay, Mark? Was that close enough? He'd give me the thumbs up. All right. That was a Yiddish American hopscotch chant. Who would have known that? I didn't know that. I had to look that up. But it's a very memorable opening sequence. Now, Laverne and Shirley, Penny Marshall was Laverne, and Cindy Williams was Shirley in that show. And it took place in the 50s and in the 60s. And these were 2 single roommates who were living in Milwaukee. They worked in a nearby as bottle cappers in a nearby factory. And the show was about their life as singles in the city, working, doing those things, and all the interactions. One of them was a little bit more prone to relationships than the other one. But the point was, it was about them and their lives as being singles. And so today, that's the topic that we're looking at, is being single. A few weeks ago, I mentioned that we were going to be talking about the topic of singleness. And I had somebody in our church, I'm not kidding you, this is true. I had somebody in my church come up to me half a dozen times since then. Every time I see this person, they say, Pastor Eric, when you talk about singles, I need you to do something for me. And I don't know, I'm like, what do you need me to do? And this person said, look, there are some well-intentioned people who just keep asking me, like, when are you going to get married? Who are you dating? What's going on in your love life? And this person's like, look, I don't need a matchmaker. I don't really want a matchmaker. I'm happy being single. Can you just tell them politely to please stop? Okay? So I'm being very vague for that person's self-interest. I don't want any repercussions on them. And look, there's no ill intent behind those questions, are there? Right? I think people naturally those are natural questions, but those are questions that reveal, I think, a bias that our culture or our world has towards relationships. Who are you dating? When are you going to get married? Why haven't you found someone to be with? Now, the questions in and of themselves aren't bad. It's the assumption behind the questions that can get us into trouble. Because the problem is that these questions can assume that if you're single, something is wrong with you, or something, maybe you're incomplete, or you're not really going to live a full life until you have a relationship. That's the problem with some of those questions. In our world today, we live in a romantic, relationship-driven culture. There's this expectation for many that you get married. If you're secular and in our secular culture, maybe marriage isn't the end goal, but certainly some sort of committed relationship with someone else is the goal for many people in our society. And to be fair, a lot of that in our society, in our secular world in particular, a lot of that is focused on the sexual relationship. I think that's why we have so much discussion today about sexual orientation and identity. It comes from the same place. So many people find value and identity in their romantic relationships. It's like the highest value or the goal. There's so much weight that's placed on that. And those relationships, we expect them to fulfill us, right? That's the kind of the view that our world has. And the result is that for those of you who are in the room today who are single, there's all sorts of pressure that you face then because of that. All these questions that people ask you. We have holidays for people in relationships. Valentine's Day, and then Sweetest Day. I remember several years ago, somebody asked me what I was doing for Sweetest Day. It's like, Sweetest Day? I didn't even heard of Sweetest Day. It's like some other made-up holiday to get us to buy cards. And all the guys secretly, don't, because I'm going to get in trouble for saying that. All the guys in the room are like, yeah. But then the women, you want the cards and the flowers. I get it, but we have holidays for this, and we even give tax credits and benefits to those who are married. And these aren't bad. It's just the reality of our society. There's this value placed on being in relationships. The problem is when we believe that our fulfillment or our identity comes from those relationships. And Paul's going to talk about that in our text today. Today we're looking at the same chapter that we looked at last week, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And what we're finding in this chapter, in chapter 7, is that Paul is addressing some questions that the church in Corinth had asked him. They had been writing back and forth, and Paul is writing in response. And I thought it would be helpful for us today to kind of just look through just a very quick, brief outline of what Paul has already addressed, because we didn't get into all this last week. And I think seeing where he went, in particular the last section, I think is really helpful for where we're going. So, first, in verses 2 through 7, Paul talked to married couples. He talked about the physical relationship that occurs between husband and wife, and he gave some instructions for those couples. Then in verses 8 and 9, he speaks to unmarried people, specifically widows and widowers, and he gives some advice to them. Then, as we saw last week, in verses 10 and 11, he talked to those who are contemplating divorce. He gives some instructions to them. And then in verses 12 through 16, he talks to believers who are married to unbelievers. And we didn't really get into this last week, but basically he says, just because your spouse is an unbeliever doesn't mean you should divorce them because of that. Instead, stay there, remain there, and be in that relationship because God might bring that person to faith because of your presence in that relationship. Now that gets us to the next section. And when you're reading along in this chapter, this section seems kind of removed. It kind of seems like a sidestep. But it's really, there's a flow going on here. And he gives application. He says, this is the point. Be faithful, believer. Be faithful in whatever situation you find yourself in. Whether your situation is good or bad, God can use it and he can redeem it. Whether you caused the situation or the situation was caused to you, be faithful because God can use you right there where you are and he can redeem it. So it's from this point that he moves into the topic of singleness. He says this in verse 25. Now, about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. So when he says now about virgins, what he's doing is he's transitioning back. He's hearkening back to, now you had some questions about people in marriage, whether they should get married or not. And Paul says, I don't have a direct command from the Lord to give you. Remember last week we were talking, and Paul says, look, Jesus spoke very specifically about marriage, and I've got a clear command for you here. But what Paul says here is, I don't have a command. And this is the reason why. This isn't an issue, getting married isn't an issue of right or wrong. Like, it's not wrong to get married, and it's not wrong to be single. What Paul's talking about is the difference between what's right and what's better. The question when it comes to marriage is, what is the wise thing to do? And what Paul's saying to the church in Corinth and to us today is that we need to use wisdom in the way that we live. Verse 26. And by the way, we're going to be going through a lot of verses today, so just bear with me. Hold on, because we're going to be flying through this. Verse 26. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. So Paul's point, it is good for you to remain single. And he gives a reason for this. It's not just like he's coming up with this in a vacuum. He says it's because of the present crisis. Because of the present crisis. So we can read this phrase very broadly or very narrowly. And I think most of the time for us today, in our day and age, when we read the Bible, many of us have an awareness of what Christ has done. Christ came and he lived and he died and he rose again. We know that there's implications for God's kingdom, and we know that the world has changed because of what Christ did. We know that we talk about the end times and the end days. We can look at this really broadly and think of the present crisis in those terms. But it's very possible that the church in Corinth at that time was dealing with a very specific crisis. And so we can look very narrowly as well. We don't know for sure, but we know that around that time there were some famines that were taking place in and near that area. So it's very possible that there was a very critical crisis going on in the church. I have a tendency to think that Paul's talking about both, because of the specific things that are going on in Corinth, but also in light of the eschatological impact of what Christ has done in coming here to earth. We need to understand that our lives are to be lived in a certain way. So the point, however, is clear. Because of the trials and the difficulties that we experience in life, Paul says staying single is a good thing. Verse 27, he says, "Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Don't look for a wife." So this kind of harkens back to the application that he gave just before this. Stay in the situation that you find yourself in. Be thoughtful about it. Verse 28. "But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this." So if Paul's not been clear, he's clear here now. You're not sinning if you get married, and you're not sinning if you don't get married. It's about wisdom. It's about evaluating what is best. And Paul's actually looking out for the well-being of his congregation. He goes, I want to spare you the troubles that you'll experience in life. Now, he's not making some kind of backhanded comment about the ball and chain, right? I mean, Paul's not trying to be like, well, marriage, you got to deal with your spouse, and that's horrible. He's not making that kind of a comment here. He's just saying that in life there are troubles, and when you engage yourself and connect yourself to someone in marriage, you are taking on the troubles that they experience in life as well. And there's just more there that you have to deal with in your life. That's the point that he's making. He's saying, look, I want to spare you. He cares about the congregation. He knows that marriage comes with great responsibility. Okay, so some of you are like, wow, most of the people in the room here are probably married. Pastor Eric, you're talking very specifically to maybe just a few people. Yes and no. Because what Paul does next is he goes very, very broad here. And what he says will apply to every single person in the room here. And what he does is he shows us now, he gives us like the framework or the foundation for why he's just given us this advice. Why he has just said to these single people to stay single. He gives us like the foundation for it in verses 29 through 31. He says this, "What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world, in its present form, is passing away." The other day, I heard someone talking about their fiancé. They were getting married. And they were talking about their fiancé, and they were talking about why they were getting married. And isn't it beautiful when there's this young couple in love, or not even a young couple, but just a couple that's in love, and waxing eloquent about how great their future spouse is and how much they love them and adore them and all those things. And you just go away and you're like, wow, that's a picture of true love. Well, this conversation that I heard was not that. It was the opposite. And this person was like, yeah, she makes me feel good. She lets me do whatever I want. So yeah, I want to marry her. You're like, that is not a good reason to get married to someone. But that was the reason that this person was giving to get married to this person. And if we're honest, I think a lot of people approach relationships in this way. Like, how does that person make me feel? Right? They make me feel accepted. They make me feel loved. They make me feel this way. Or what we think of is, how do I feel about this person? When I'm around that person, I got that quiver in my liver. You know what I mean? Woo! Right? You get all, come on, you know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. You get all excited. And what is it? Your relationship then is based so much on, how do they make me feel? What do they do for me? How can they improve my life? And Paul is suggesting here, shocking, our fulfillment, what we get out of it, isn't the most important concern. And what Paul's teaching these people is he's saying, don't worry about your relationship status. Focus on your attitude and your perspective overall. Your fulfillment should not be found in whether you're married or not. Your fulfillment, he says here, should not be found in whether you are happy or not. It doesn't matter. Your fulfillment shouldn't be based on whether you are sad or not. And your possessions, the things that you buy, the things that you use, that's where you can't find your value in life in those things. Now, Paul's not telling us to withdraw from the world, but he's telling us as we are consumers in this world, we better not be consumed by this world. Because that's what happens for so many of us. We get involved in this world, and all of a sudden, all we see are the relationships. All we see are the happiness, or the sadness, or the possessions, or our use of them. We get so overwhelmed by it. Your relationship with Jesus is paramount. No other relationships, no other possession, no emotion should rule you. Only look to your relationship with Jesus. Because for Paul, the arrival and the work of Jesus has radically altered the believer's relationship to the world. I mean, we live in this world like everybody else. We may get married, we may have relationships, we'll experience sorrow, we experience joy, we buy and use goods, but none of that determines our life as followers of Christ. None of those things define us. None of those things should own us. The scholar Gordon Fee, I was doing some research this week looking at this passage, and on this verse, Gordon Fee says this. He says, the Christian is marked by eternity. I love that. The Christian is marked by eternity. Therefore, he or she is not under the dominating power of those things that dictate the existence of others. Like when you look at the world around us, Paul has just given us 5 examples. Our relationships, happiness, sorrow, our stuff, and then our use of our stuff and our possessions. He gives us 5 examples. Our world is dictated by those things. Who am I going to be with? How do I find my identity in this person? I've got to be happy. I've got to avoid sorrow at all costs. I've got to get stuff. I've got to use stuff. That's where I find my identity. That's where I find myself. But Christian, we are not to be marked by those things. Instead, we are to be marked by eternity. And so I just want to ask you to do some self-evaluation today. Are you marked with eternity, or are you marked by your relationships? Are you marked by your stuff? Are you marked, students, by your grades? Or are you marked by your athletic achievement? What are you marked by in your life? Because for the Christian, it should be eternity. The Christian, to use Paul's words, is to live as if not. As if not. It's like we walk through this world, we live in this world, but it's as if not going to rule over us. It's not going to overwhelm us. We're not going to look for that to be our identity. Being a Christian is not just a title we take on. The gospel isn't just something that you can tack on to your life or wear it as a badge. being a Christian is more than just an hour on a weekend at a service. The gospel demands every single part of your life. It demands that you live as if not, that you sell yourself out for this. Why? Because as a follower of Jesus, we believe that this world, in its present form, is passing away. Now, it's Halloween season, and some of you, maybe you've already been eating the Halloween candy early, right? But I know that in my family, there's something that happens in my dietary, schedule that changes around Halloween. So here's why. I don't eat a lot of candy. I'm not a candy person. I don't, stop over at Walgreens or something and just buy a big thing of candy. And if I ever do get a bunch of candy, I have a candy bowl in my office, and it'll sit there for months. And I'll just have a little bit here and there. The only time it really starts disappearing is when Kent comes by. And my son Kent, he just will tear into it. And then, I'm going to tell on you, where's he at? He will leave the wrappers in the candy bowl. That's like a big no-no for me. Anyway, but I don't eat a lot of candy. But I do eat a lot of candy around Halloween. And it's not just because there's Halloween candy left over. And you know this, the good Halloween candy doesn't last long, right? In our house, the good Halloween candy goes quickly. So I got to get in there and I got to eat my share right away very quickly. Otherwise, all the Snicker bars are gone and all the Skittles are gone. And we're left with candy corn. I mean, come on. Nobody, by 3 or 4 days out, it's all candy corn and Smarties. And you're like, oh man, and little suckers. And you're like, no, or cheap chocolate. I want the good stuff. So what do? I know that the good candy is temporary, so I'm changing my diet, and I'm just going on a strict chocolate and sugar diet for the next 2 days, right? You know what I'm talking about. This is the same idea that Paul's saying, look, our world is temporary. And so, believer, you should act differently. You should look differently. You should interact with this world in a different way, because it's urgent, much more urgent than eating all the good candy, all right? Church, are you living marked with eternity? Or are you just going, man, everything is here in my possessions. Everything is here in this relationship. Or do you have a broader perspective? That's what Paul's talking about here today. And this idea now gets us back around to the idea of being single or being married. Because that's the framework that Paul's using to talk about this issue. Again, he's not barking out orders. He's not trying to rail on them or give them some command. He's wanting the congregation to live in wisdom, and he wants them to live as if not, to be thoughtful of how they live within the circumstances that they find themselves in. He says this lastly here in verse 32. He says this, I would like you to be free from concern. This is the main idea in these verses. Notice how many times the word concern shows up in these 4 verses. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. Verse 35. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way, in undivided devotion to the Lord. The key idea here is concern or anxiety or worry or energy or mental time spent on these issues. And in Paul's view, he's oversimplifying here, okay? He knows he's oversimplifying, but he's making a greater point. He's saying, look, if you're married, you're concerned about your relationship with God and serving him. But if you're married, you're also concerned about your family. And if you're single, you're worried about your relationship with the Lord. And you don't have a family that will also take mental energy from you. It's an oversimplification. Not every single person in the room here today, has a simple I got nothing else to do. I understand that. Life is busy. You have bills. You work. It can be stressful. I understand all that. But Paul's broad point is simply that if you're single, you have an ability to focus your energy and your time on your relationship with Christ and serving him. Paul's not trying to restrict, but he's wanting to actually free people up and say, look, you don't have to be married. It's okay to be single. And he goes on even after this, and he says it's preferable. again, because of the circumstances that they were facing. Paul says, you have a great ability to fulfill the Lord's work in your life. I have a friend who, he's a few years older than I am, but he gave his 20s to Jesus. Like, this is a guy who was more than capable of getting a date. It wasn't one of those things where he wasn't getting a date. He's like, well, I might as well give my 20s. No, this guy is an eligible bachelor, but he said, no, I'm going to give my 20s in service to the Lord. Now, I don't think that every single person has to do that, but that's what he did. And I'm telling you, he influenced in a positive way the lives of hundreds and hundreds of young people, high school and college age students, because he said selflessly, I'm going to live as if not. Everybody else is like, hey, when are you going to get married? Hey, who are you going to date? Hey, what's going on with this? And he said, no, I'm going to focus my time and my energy for this decade, and I'm going to give it in service to the Lord. That's a high calling, but that was a calling he felt like God had given to him. When I look back at my life, especially when I was younger, some of the most significant relationships and people that influenced me in a positive way in my relationship with Christ came from single people. There's several. I just want to mention two today. One is a man named Pete. Pete still is single, and Pete was one of my youth workers. Pete, every year, at least that I was in high school and into college, Pete would do a 40-day fast, like water fast, like we'd only drink water. 40 days. He did it year after year. He actually got to a point after several years where he was getting so thin because of it that he said, I got to stop doing it every year because it's just becoming unhealthy for me. But he was a man who knew God's word, spent time in prayer and in devotion to God. Pete showed me a way of living out my faith that I had never seen before, and showing me the disciplines that I could have as a young man, as a believer. And he also did practical things. One time, my alternator in my car broke down, and I remember he came over like at 10 o'clock at night. We had lights on in the garage, hunkered over. He helped me fix the alternator in my car. This guy, Pete, was a servant, and he cared for me. He invested in me. He prayed for me. He was a single guy, and he had given extra time to be able to do that. There's another lady. I mentioned last week my parents went through a divorce when I was in junior high. And I have a good relationship with my family now. At the time, I didn't really want to be around my family a lot. It was just not fun during that season. And there was a lady named Debbie who kind of, and I mean this with all great respect. I know my mom listens to the podcast, but she was like a second mom to me. She really was. And this lady, Debbie, she invited me and several other students over to her house for like this little Bible study prayer thing that we did. I think it was my senior year. It was like, I think once a month. And she would bake cookies and stuff for us. And she spent time investing into my life. Taught me a ton about prayer, about what it means to follow Jesus and what it means to serve him. Now, why do I say that? I say that, I'm not trying to make any single person in the room feel guilty, like you got to go be a youth worker or something. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there were some single people that had a perspective that allowed them to be able to be used of the Lord in a very unique way. Now, it may not be with student ministries, but you perhaps have an ability to invest in the lives of somebody else. I want to just give a couple of application points, and then we'll talk about response, and then we're going to close. First, I want to talk to singles, then I want to talk to people in relationships. So first, to singles. Some of you are singles in the room here today, and I recognize that you don't want to be single anymore. You're like one of those people that you don't feel like singleness is your calling in life, and I get that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But I want to encourage you, don't find your identity in your relationship status. Yeah. Don't find your identity like, I gotta get a man, I gotta get a woman, I've gotta get married, Don't find your identity in that. There's nothing wrong with wanting to get married. There's nothing wrong wanting to date. But live as if not. Don't allow that to override your life. Don't find identity in your relationship status. Only find it in your relationship with Christ. And then two, let me challenge you that you might, And I realize there's a variety of situations in the room today for different people that are single in the room. But you might have some extra margin in your life because you don't have a family. Consider how you can use that in service to the Lord and create an impact on other people that you may not even recognize how significant it could be in this moment. All right? Now, to non-singles or those who are in relationships, you're married or you're in a relationship, I have similar advice for you. Don't find your identity in your relationship status. Some of you live and breathe based on how your spouse looks at you in the morning, right? Some of you are looking for validation in your relationship. Am I worthwhile? Yes, because this person said so. No, find your identity in Christ first, not in the relationship that you are in. And the challenge for you, don't forsake your family, but live as though you were single, with undivided attention or devotion to the Lord. Live with an understanding that this world in its present form is passing away. Live as if not. Because the challenge for us that are married, that do have families, is we tend to think all about that. And our eyes can drift down into the here and the now, and we can lose sight of the fact that God's called us to eternal purposes. And so if you're married in the room today, don't find your identity in that relationship, but also find ways to keep your eyes in undivided devotion to the Lord as well. So I have two responses for us in the room here today. And the first is this. Some of you today, maybe you're here and you're not a believer. You've never been a Christian. But as we've been talking, maybe even coming for a few weeks, but as we've been talking today, you're just maybe more aware of your need for something greater. Maybe you've been looking for relationships and you've been looking for love in all the wrong places, right? Maybe today you can recognize that Christ is the place that you've been looking for all this time. I want you to know that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And if you just feel like every relationship that you're in keeps on falling short and you're disappointed and you're maybe a little lost in life, and maybe you know that there's something else out there, I'm telling you, you're not going to find it in a dating relationship, in a marriage, and those things. You're going to find it only in Christ. So if you do not know Christ today, I want to encourage you, call out in the name of the Lord, and you will be saved. And second, live as if not. This applies to every believer in the room here today, whether you are single or whether you're married. Live as if not, with that greater perspective, saying, God, this world in its present form is passing away. And I want to have that mindset that motivates me to go out in this world. Not to look for fulfillment here, but to look for it in Christ alone. Let's pray.